Good morning, my name is Alexandra, and as Tamara said, I work at the International School of Belgrade as an English language and literature teacher, and I used to work at the French school. I've been teaching for 10 years, and what I'd like to show you is how you can integrate CLIL into your own teaching and how to implement it. I'll start by clarifying what CLIL is. It is an approach, an educational approach in which both the content that is taught and the language in which it is taught are equally important, and they are the goal of your teaching. It is an umbrella term of a variety of approaches which are based on context, and immersion programs, bilingual programs are all a part of CLIL. And you might ask yourself why it's talked about and why it's important to integrate it into our educational system. It's because it's got a lot of benefits, and not just, as you've heard before, for enrolling into university or for future careers. It is beneficial to students while they are in your classroom. For example, it is a natural way of learning a language because everything is based on a context, and your students will have an opportunity to be in situations that are authentic. And that is why that is called, the CLIL approach is often described as an authentic learning experience. Also, learners will develop different skills, not just language skills, not even just subject matter skills, but also thinking skills, whether it's critical thinking skills or creative thinking skills. They will be able to develop that throughout this approach. Another benefit of CLIL is that you can design activities which are at the same cognitive level as your students. Therefore, the engagement will be much greater by your students, and the motivation will be greater as well. CLIL is also known to boost students' confidence because the focus is not just on language itself, but also on content. Your students might have prior knowledge of the subject that you're teaching and base their confidence on that. And finally, another benefit of it is global citizenship, because CLIL contains a cultural component which is sometimes very difficult to implement into second language teaching. It is important to understand that there isn't only one way to implement CLIL into educational systems, and across Europe there are different models. But it is also vital to understand that good practices mean that your teaching provides a holistic educational experience for your students. And what that means will be seen in the following examples. What I wanted to do is to illustrate what CLIL might look like and show you activities that you could use or perhaps be inspired to create your own. And I'd like to start by showing you something that fits well the description of a holistic approach. And that is something that's widely used in immersion programs. It is the class calendar routine, and probably a lot of you already use it. It doesn't have to look like this. This is just an example of the activities that might be components of your class calendar, but obviously you will make the decision of what the components will be based on what your objectives are or what you've already taught. And the idea is that you can have the class calendar on the board, you can use an interactive whiteboard if you prefer, and each lesson, at the beginning of the day or your lesson, one student is in charge of doing the class calendar and presenting information to others. That is interactive for the student, but also the others are involved because they have the model of the correct language. Obviously, as the teacher, you will first model the procedure and the correct sentence structures and language use. But very quickly, students are able to do this independently with just minor support. And As you can see, there is the calendar through which the students will learn how to use it. It might seem obvious, but to young learners, it's not necessarily the case. They will develop their math skills, so how to measure time. Also, they will be exposed to ordinal numbers and their significance. As for language, they will learn days of the week, months in a year, also be exposed to capitalization, which is not the same in every language, and spelling. And you can, at first, if you're working with young learners, you can ask them to use cards. So once they've identified the correct day and date, the students can find the right cards and put the date on the board. And later on, you can scaffold and you can move towards them writing the full date on the board. What I also liked to do is, once the student is telling the date, they would also talk about what the date was yesterday or just the day and tomorrow, in order to model the correct forms of verb to be and also develop awareness of tenses. Also, whether the students will look outside and find the right card or write the weather. They will identify the correct season, and perhaps if you've taught in science or the classroom teacher has taught in science how to use a thermometer and measure temperature, the students could do that as well and tell you how many degrees there are. This was an activity that students really enjoyed, and it was linked to maths. This is how we introduced place value. The students would have 3 cups labeled ones, tens, and hundreds, and they would have plastic straws. For each day of school, they would put a straw in the ones cup. As there would be 10 days, they would make a bundle of 10 and move it to the 10th cup, and so on and so forth. Occasionally, we'd ask the students to count. One student would count together with the whole class. So how many days have we spent at school? And they would practice counting and numbers. So this was a fun and interactive activities for students, but also they are learning math through that, and they can visualize what place value means. Schedule, a schedule can be based on school subjects and their day at school. You can introduce, I don't know, breakfast or coming to school with the times. It is important for understanding daily routines and talking about daily routines using present simple, and perhaps so throughout the year you might get to ask them, so what do we usually do on Mondays, or what does our day look like on Fridays, etc. And finally, I think that this can be very difficult for young students, but it depends on your approach as well. You can ask them to tell the time, whether it's an analog clock or a digital clock, that's up to you. And obviously, again, students are practicing measuring time and also talking and using language correctly to tell the time. Another option for class calendar is to create an Advent calendar in December, which is a kind of a countdown to Christmas. And now, in this case, students wouldn't get presents on each day, but they would have a fun or interesting activity for each day until Christmas. And that can be just a Christmas carol that you will learn together, or word problems that you can either find or create and integrate Christmas vocabulary that you want them to learn. I don't know, someone's got 5 stockings, another person's got 6. How many stockings have they got together? But they will hear the word stocking, and that will be your input. And you can see here just the objectives and the goals of such activities. Math is a really good way to develop math skills throughout these calendar routines and activities. This is a fun activity which develops multiplication and division skills. but also it's a code breaker. The students are supposed to find out the message, read it, and understand it. This was an opportunity for me to present this website to you, which is called Math Salamanders. They've got engaging activities for students, math activities for different ages and grade levels. Now, routines are just an activity that you can develop throughout the year and work on different skills. In order to have your students experience the same approach in different subjects, it is vital to plan your curriculum, whether it's with the classroom teachers or subject teachers. It is good to plan in advance how to integrate both your teaching as a language instructor and the classroom teacher's teaching. And this is just a snippet of the curriculum we created at the French school. And you can see the main skill and the skills that the students are supposed to develop. And then at the end, activities, which we agreed upon and then decided which activities will be done in French, that's the language of instruction, and which will be done in English, and how that will look. So if you see, so the main skills here is about find one's bearings in place and time, and if you look at day and night, how day and night alternate. One activity that was done in French was sun path experiment. Students would go out with their classroom teacher, and they would, in the morning first, and take a photo of the shadow. They would go out later in the afternoon again and take another photo, and they would realize that the shadow has moved, which is a way for them to understand, oh, okay, therefore the sun is moving, which for young learners is not really obvious. And then the globe experiment, as a continuation of that experiment, in the classroom we would take the globe and a flashlight and then light the globe to see where's the day, where's the night. And this was all planned ahead, and we tried to have one lesson in French, then one lesson in English, then again one lesson in French, so that students would have this holistic experience of just learning about day and night alteration and not learning French or learning English. And you can also go further and go beyond just one subject. You can organize your teaching thematically. So if we talk about day and night again, and if you're doing in science solar rotation, you might want to explore Monet's paintings and discuss how night or day, sunrise in this case, are represented, and then go beyond, talk about characteristics of Impressionism. And the final product would obviously be students using watercolors to show their idea of their perception of night and day. In maths, obviously measuring time comes back, and you might think of math problems that involve hours, how many hours in a day, or I don't know, with days or weeks. And you can choose a work of literature or a non-fiction or just a magazine article that is simple enough. The example here is very simple and explains solar rotation quite well. And as you can see, I've tried to include literature or books in these examples because that is an excellent model of correct and authentic language. This is obviously, these are not supposed to be, oh, you have to do it or you have to do it like this. It depends on you as a teacher, which you feel comfortable with, which subjects you'd like to teach, or which teachers you'd like to work with. But I'd just like to show you how you can organize your teaching to explore concepts with your students rather than focus just on grammatical parts or subjects or one skill. This is perhaps for all the students, immigration, if you want to explore it. There's a lovely story, The Name Jar by Yang Suk Choi, which talks about a Korean girl who moves with her family to the United States, and she tries to fit in and to be the same as the American girls. Maths, you might want to use data about immigration to talk about graphs and charts, different ways of representing data. PE, you could ask your students to research about activities around the world, what games are played in different parts of the world or countries, and then you can play them. Science, perhaps you want to explore the human body and pretend that your students need to pass a medical exam, an immigration medical exam, and then talk about different parts of the body. This is again something for all the students, dystopian unit, but it is something that has worked well with high school students. This is, so you can base your teaching on one of the dystopian novels. These are just the classics that are well known, but you can also do The Hunger Games. That's also dystopia. It's very popular with students. And you can use the issues explored in those novels to have your own debates and Socratic seminars in class. And that is also a way of developing language skills. In history, you might want your students to compare totalitarian systems, do some research, and then find characteristics of totalitarian systems throughout history. Science, depending on the novel you've chosen, it can be inventions or genetic engineering. If you're doing Brave New World, it can be about cloning. And in art, you can find examples of utopia and ask students to create their own utopia using any kind of technique you'd like them to use. And this is just how to organize your teaching in advance. But what about practical activities, specific activities that you might use? I'll proceed by giving you more examples in order to illustrate this approach further. And one thing that has inspired me is The Book Whisperer by Donalyn Miller. She is a 6th grade teacher in the US, and she begins her every lesson by reading time, about 15 minutes of reading time. And you might think it is a waste of time, or you'd feel useless as a teacher, and at the beginning, I admit that was the case. But the benefits are enormous. I've seen a change in my students because those 15 minutes, at first, they might not read, they might pretend to read, but then they realize they have no other option. This will happen every day, and they start reading. And then they become engaged in what the story is about, and they continue to read at home. And as you know, avid readers have excellent language skills. And it might look like a lot of time to devote just to reading, but obviously during this time, at the end of it, we chat, we talk about the books they're reading, about the books I'm reading. You're modeling their reading behavior. How do we talk about books? How do we give reasons for something we like or we don't like? And it is important to model that option of saying, I do not like this book, because students will often feel embarrassed telling you as a teacher that they didn't like something. And I won't give this book justice if I give you an overview. I do recommend you try to find it and read it. It is absolutely amazing, and it talks about how to develop intrinsic motivation, meaning how can students on their own wish to read. Also, this approach is significant because it allows choice. This teacher doesn't do prescribed book list that everyone has to read. Based on their interests, students choose books, and then they all do activities that are common, analyzing different elements of literature, for example. I mentioned modeling authentic reading behaviors. It is so important that she discarded busy work. Busy work means a lot of worksheets, which seem like students are doing a lot of things, but are they really learning? And finally, you will improve students' vocabulary, comprehension, and writing by encouraging them to read, by giving them options and suggestions what to read. Another example, and you'll see I've tried to find examples from different subjects, is a game of a treasure hunt. It's something we did in PE with 1st grade students, because one of the skills they need to develop is reading a map and understanding a relationship between a map and the real space. Obviously, this is just a part of a longer instructional sequence. This was a culmination of it. And what you can see is a map. This is an indoor space, but we played outside. So you can do it indoors or outdoors. And there are numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, which mark the places where the students should go. So they go to place number 1. There they would find a card with a symbol, and they need to write it down in the box. They proceed to number 2, 3, 4, and the first group, they played in groups. The first group, to find all the symbols, should come to the teacher and show and check whether they were right. And that is the moment when you ask the students to rephrase where they've been. So they are, so not only are they practicing spatial skills, but also you need them to use prepositions. You need them to use correct sentences to describe where they've been. Another option is to just give them the first place to visit and then not only give them a symbol that they should write, but also a clue as to where they should go next. And if your students can read, the clue can be in written form. Again, they need to understand instructions, written instructions and prepositions. If they can't read, it can be a photo. And then you would ask them not only to visit those places, but trace their path on the map, which is quite a complex thing to do for a first grader. This is an example of an art activity. This is an artist called Jerry Welsman, and his photographs are an example of surrealism. In general, art is an excellent way of developing different kinds of skills, critical thinking skills, then language skills. And it is good that in art, you don't really have a correct or incorrect answer. You're basing your whole discussion on the student's imagination. So whatever they think is right is fine, but they will talk. And they might not have all the language at first, and that is fine because you will provide it. You will have constant interaction with your students, and you will model how to discuss art. It'll also introduce them to symbolism. They might not be able, your students might not be able to name it and to say that that is symbolism, but they'll be able to discuss what they can see and then what that might represent. And that is a development of critical thinking skills. After discussing these photographs, the students would proceed to choose magazines and create collages of their own surrealist artwork. And so I've mentioned several times that not only are you developing language skills or subject matter skills, you are developing overall thinking skills. And if it is impossible to plan your curriculum in the way I showed it, you might want to base your CLIL approach on strategies that both the classroom teachers and language teachers would use. And this is something that is very popular in the United States at the moment. These are called visible thinking routines. They're very simple to use, but they are very important for you students to learn how to talk about thinking and their process of thinking, and also how to think deeply. This approach is designed to create to develop students' thinking, but also deepen their content learning. The beauty of it is that you can use these strategies in to work on different kinds of content. And an example of it is color symbol image. You might have heard. I use it in literature. And when I talked before about the approach of thematic organization, where you would perhaps base your unit on a dystopian novel, the novel might be read in the student's mother tongue, and you could only work on excerpts from that. And this is a good way to use the excerpt to ask your students to provide a color symbol image responds to it. So in this case, a student was talking about the Hunger Games and chose red, and then there's the explanation. I chose red because it reminds me of anger. I chose a fist because it reminds me of rebellion. And then at the end, image is a part of the novel that the student found very significant. And with this activity, I'd like to remind you how thinking skills are vital to any kind of teaching, whether you're a language teacher or a classroom teacher. That is our job, making students think, giving them opportunities to think, giving them opportunities to become inquirers, because then one day everything will come easily. Yeah, that is all. Thank you.